man in a glass coffin. Where do you come up with these weird ideas, Deb? What is in your head? Freeze-dried people, glass coffins, homeless guys on the street. The idea for the mystery plot came from an article that I read when I was at Ragdale Foundation, which is an artist retreat in Lake Forest, north of Chicago. And I was sitting there eating my very first bagel ever. This was years ago. And reading the Chicago Tribune, and there was an article there about freeze drying and how they were using freeze drying to preserve people's pets, kind of like a form of taxidermy, but totally done differently. And it produced lifelike replicas. And one of the men they were interviewing was talking about how eventually they were going to do that to humans. And it was this great thing. It was going to replace embalming and all these people, you know, you could have people like Lincoln, you know, Lincoln was to resurrect himself and then will die once again, could be on display in a lifelike way and be preserved that way forever, basically, with this new process. And he used a phrase that gave me an idea for a character. He said something like, it'd be like a big pizza oven, where you just take them out when they're done, and you just put another one in, and also they were posing the cats and the dogs in different positions, like sleeping or standing or eating or something like that. So that is where the idea came from for the mystery part of this. And I'm going to read a little section here that talks about the homeless guy in the glass coffin. I think I'm okay on time here. All right. Oh, and to set this one up, after the meal with Lexi, Joe is sort of driving around the north end of Chicago late at night because she can't sleep, and some sirens go off, and she's a reporter, so she has to go see what's going on, so might as well. And she almost runs over some kid, and when she stops, the policeman is running after him and asks her if she saw him. And when she asks the policeman what's going on, she finds out this kid had just been trying to rob a funeral home, and she's thinking, oh, homeless guy in a glass coffin, robbery at a funeral home. There's got to be some connection here, so she's investigating if there is. Midnight interviews at funeral parlors, not exactly the way they map things out in Journalism 405, strategic communication research, but then nothing about Joe's situation now related to what life had been back then. You can't handle the big city, her father had said when she told them her plans of graduation. You'll be murdered and in the headlines before you ever break print in one of those papers. Then she sprang the announcement of her internship at the Chicago Tribune. He acted like they'd hired her just to piss him off. But Joe and Chicago understood each other. 5 years in the city had taught her street sense. It certainly couldn't throw her anything worse than small-town Iowa already had. Across the street, two guys walked in shadows. Neither looked her way. When she got back to the alley entrance, the stain of blue and white lights still revolved at the far end. The police were parked there talking to neighbors, calling in the report. But cops she could interview anytime. A trip to the station tomorrow, a flash of her reporter's ID, and she'd get everything she could out of them. The opportunity she couldn't pass up, however, beckoned from an open door about halfway down the alley, spilling light onto the bricks. She approached slowly. A ripped garbage bag caught on the corner of a dumpster fluttered in the slight breeze. The building opposite the open door had vague light behind one window, but otherwise seemed silent and unoccupied. An aluminum can rattled somewhere as a gust of air nudged it along the tarmac. Hello? Joe rapped her knuckles against the open door and leaned over the threshold. Anybody here? Inside the unoccupied room was a cluttered desk with two well-worn leather chairs. A pastoral print hung slightly crooked behind it, and along the wall, lit by an incandescent lamp, lay a white-haired man in a glass coffin. May I help you? Joe jerked around, hand fisted with the blade of her car key like a lethal spike between two fingers. Standing in the alley with hands clasped, the man who had alarmed Lexi at Felipe's earlier that night waited for an answer. I'm Joe Sullivan, she started awkwardly, shoulders and fists tense. From Winds of Change. I heard the sirens and the police car. I thought I'd stop and see. I'm a reporter, she added, not sure she'd been clear at first. The thief, he sputtered, crossing his hands against his chest. My God, yes, so terrifying. My heart, I thought it would burst from my chest. He shuddered with the violence of a sheepdog throwing off rainwater and glanced both ways down the dark alley. Please, let's go inside. The lenses of his wire-rimmed spectacles caught the office light streaming from behind Joe. The refraction hid his eyes behind the circles of what looked like shattered glass. Joe stepped aside so he could pass. Hesitantly, she followed him inside. She shut the door but stood with her back close to it. This is my office, he was saying. I'm Dean Whiteside of Sloan & Whiteside. I was working at my desk, you see. He walked to it as he spoke. I often work late, so quiet and peaceful. I heard voices outside. He sat behind the desk and motioned to one of the leather chairs in front of him. Joe did not move. Voices at this time of night. So naturally, I was worried. Suspicious, you might say. His eyebrows drew together in a V as he looked at her. Such a terrible neighborhood. You see such terrible things these days. Voices, he'd said. So the boy must have had an accomplice. What had happened to... Her attention strayed to the glass coffin. She tried to focus. Someone was trying to break into your office, she asked. No, not here. Across the alley, our work area. I peeked outside and I saw a young man sneaking in through the door. Big, broad shoulders, very scary looking, terrifying, I tell you. Joe pictured the boy pinned in her headlights. Thin, starved-looking face, eyes wide and doe-like. Naturally, I called the police right away, but then I started to think, what if he destroyed equipment, murdered my assistant while he was sleeping? The police take so long to respond to distress calls. It's alarming, really. So little protection in this miserable city. He stopped then and waited. His smile, chipped from ice, did nothing to warm the opaque gray of his eyes. Under that look, Joe felt like a Luna moth flying into an entomologist's laboratory. Except for that and Lexi's fear earlier, Joe might have relaxed, dismissed him even. Meeting his gaze straight on, she finally took a chair. From the corner of her eye, she could still see the glass coffin and its occupant. So you went over there to take a look, she asked. He told her what had happened then, what little there was to tell. He'd hesitated outside, and in a moment the thief had burst from the building, attacked him, and threw him to the alley, then ran off, leaving the loot behind. Formaldehyde? She asked when he told her what the boy had been trying to steal. What would he want that for? Who knows these days? Perhaps in his desperate, drug-crazed state, he just grabbed whatever he could without even thinking about it. Joe only listened to it with half her attention. The rest of her was acutely aware of the coffin she itched to ask about. Miss Sullivan, Whiteside said. She met his gaze again. Shouldn't you be taking notes? This is for a story, you said, correct? The sound of a clock she hadn't even noticed before seemed suddenly loud. To be honest, Mr. Whiteside, I find the man in that glass coffin a lot more interesting than this robbery that didn't happen. She turned in her chair to look directly at the casket. Sculpted curls of cast iron decorated each corner. The bed within the coffin was black silk. A small pillow, black also, propped up a neatly barbered head with a clipped mustache, closed eyes, and rosy shades of life carefully painted on the face. The corpse wore a charcoal gray suit. The shirt was white, the tie a silver blue. I know rich men can be eccentric, she said, but this Snow White setup is a little disturbing. Why is it in your office? Whiteside rubbed his hands together. Oh, thank you for mistaking him for someone of consequence, I mean. What a testament to the excellent work we do here. He's an indigent, Miss Sullivan. Yes, truly. As little as 4 months ago, this man was living on the streets in filthy, unsanitary conditions. Yet, look what we have been able to accomplish. He walked over to the coffin as he spoke and laid a hand on the top, smiling down at the man inside. I just put him on display today. I thought this was the perfect setting, small, more intimate than the public rooms. I believe clients get a better feel for how personal the sublimation method is as opposed to traditional embalming. So many questions crowded Joe's brain. Which one should she ask first? Sublimation? Yes, a process that will revolutionize the embalming industry. I guarantee it. Sloan & Whiteside is at the forefront of this new technology. We are making our reputation. We are staking our reputation on its success. So he's in here as a sort of an exhibit? This is legal? Of course it's legal. The bite in his tone made her press back in her chair. What are you implying? Nothing. A deep flush spread up Whiteside's face from under his collar into the thin mouse-brown hair at the crown of his head. Do you know what we do to embalm a body, Ms. Sullivan? The intrusive, gruesome invasion of flesh? He breathed out with a disgusted sound. Joe stood up and took a step back. Clearly, she had pushed one of his issue buttons. You would cringe, I am sure, he continued, if you had to witness the surgical and chemical processes necessary to preserve the dead. This, he waved his hand toward Tommy, this is a kindness and a gentler touch compared to that, I assure you. Joe held her hands out in front of her. Calm down, Mr. Whiteside. I didn't mean, perhaps you'd better go, Miss Sullivan. He walked around the desk to the exit and paused with his hand on the doorknob. Whiteside and Sloane's will not be fodder for some tabloid trash newspaper that wants to entertain bored middle-class housewives. It was Joe's turn to flush. Winds of change is not, I said goodbye, Miss Sullivan. He opened the door and stood even more rigid than before. His face stretched thin and sharp, his pinstripe jacket falling from bony, upright shoulders. Joe had to pass close to him as she left. He smelled of aftershave and something more medicinal-like. The crick between her shoulder blades did not ease until he closed the door and left her standing in the alley alone. Then, finally, she took a deep breath of relief and promptly noticed the young man staring at her from the mouth of the alley.